October 14th, 1962. A U-2 spy plane flies high over the jungles of Cuba. The pilot snaps hundreds of photographs. When the film is developed in Washington, CIA analysts see something that makes their blood run cold. They see patterns in the jungle. They see launch pads. They see nuclear missiles pointed at the heart of the United States. President John F. Kennedy is informed immediately. The Cuban Missile Crisis has begun. The world is standing on the edge of a cliff. For 13 days, humanity holds its breath, waiting for the fire that will end civilization. But here is the question that history books often gloss over. How did the Americans know exactly what they were looking at? How did they know the range of those missiles? How did Kennedy know he could push Khrushchev without triggering a war? The answer lies in the mind of one man, a man who was not an American. He was a colonel in Soviet military intelligence, a war hero, a trusted member of the Soviet elite. While the world trembled, his secrets were sitting on the president's desk. He betrayed his country to save the world, and for his sacrifice, he would pay a price more horrific than any spy before him. Welcome to the Shadow Dossier. Today, we open the file on the most important spy of the Cold War, Oleg Penkovsky. To understand Penkovsky, you have to understand the atmosphere of Moscow in 1960. It was a time of paranoia and bluster. The Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev, was banging his shoe on the table at the United Nations. He was shouting, "We will bury you!" He claimed the Soviet Union was churning out nuclear missiles like sausages. The West was terrified. The CIA was blind. They had no idea if Khrushchev was telling the truth or if he was bluffing. They needed someone on the inside. Oleg Penkovsky was the ultimate insider. He was a colonel in the GRU, the Soviet Military Intelligence Agency. He was handsome, vain, and arrogant. He loved fine clothes, good food, and the attention of women. He had risen through the ranks thanks to his connections. His great-uncle was a powerful general. Penkovsky had access to the highest levels of the Soviet military machine. But beneath the medals and the uniform, Penkovsky was a man consumed by disillusionment. He looked at Khrushchev and saw a dangerous, uneducated peasant who was gambling with the lives of millions. Penkovsky had seen the horrors of World War II. He knew what war looked like, and he was terrified that Khrushchev's reckless aggression would trigger a nuclear holocaust that would destroy Russia. He decided to act. But becoming a traitor is not easy. You cannot just pick up the phone and call the CIA. In 1960, Penkovsky tried to make contact. He was desperate. He approached American students on the streets of Moscow. He handed them letters. He tried to pass messages to the Canadian embassy. But the West was suspicious. They thought he was a dangle, a fake defector sent by the KGB to feed them disinformation. The CIA ignored him. Penkovsky didn't give up. He knew the secrets he held were too important. Finally, fate intervened in the form of a British businessman named Greville Wynne. Greville Wynne was the perfect cover. He was a salesman, traveling to Moscow to sell industrial machinery. He was not a trained spy. He was a civilian. But MI6, British intelligence, asked him to keep his eyes open. In April 1961, Penkovsky met Wynne at the Hotel National in Moscow. He saw his chance. He approached the British businessman. He didn't talk about machinery. He talked about the end of the world. He gave Wynne a package of documents and a letter addressed to the Queen of England. When Wynne returned to London, he handed the package to MI6. The British analysts were stunned. This wasn't low-level gossip. This was gold. MI6 immediately contacted the CIA. They realized they had stumbled upon the holy grail of intelligence. A mole at the top of the Soviet General Staff. The operation that followed was one of the most productive in the history of espionage. It was codenamed Ironbark by the Americans. Penkovsky was given the codename Hero. Because Penkovsky was a senior officer dealing with scientific research, he was allowed to travel to the West as part of trade delegations. This gave him the perfect opportunity to meet his handlers. In April 1961, Penkovsky arrived in London. To his Soviet minders, he was there to discuss steel and trade, but every night he slipped away to a safe house in a hotel. There, he met with a team of CIA and MI6 officers The debriefings were intense. Penkovsky was a volcano of information. He talked for hours. He talked until his voice gave out. He wanted to tell them everything. He was driven by a massive ego. He demanded to be treated like a hero. He asked for a U.S. colonel's uniform to be made for him. He even asked to meet the Queen, which didn't happen. The CIA and MI6 indulged him. They stroked his ego because he was giving them the keys to the Soviet kingdom. During his trips to London and Paris, Penkovsky provided thousands of pages of documents, but the real work happened back in Moscow. The CIA gave him a Minox camera. It is a tiny spy camera, small enough to fit in the palm of a hand. Penkovsky lived a double life of extreme danger. By day, he was the loyal Soviet colonel. By night, he was a spy. He would lock the door of his office at the GRU headquarters. He would stand on a chair to reach the top shelves where the most secret manuals were kept. He would snap photo after photo. Missile schematics, launch protocols, rocket engine blueprints, reports on the readiness of the Soviet nuclear arsenal. He also used his apartment. He would turn on the radio to mask the sound of the camera shutter clicking. He hid the film rolls in a jar of shaving cream or a box of cigarettes. He passed this film to Greville Wynne during his visits to Moscow, or he used dead drops in the city, leaving packages behind radiators in apartment hallways for Janet Chisholm, the wife of a British diplomat, to pick up. The intelligence Penkovsky provided changed the entire equation of the Cold War. He revealed that Khrushchev was lying. The Soviet Union was not churning out missiles like sausages. Their intercontinental ballistic missile program was a mess. Their guidance systems were faulty. Their fuel was unstable. He proved that the missile gap, the American fear that Russia had more nukes than the US, was a myth. In reality, the US had a massive advantage, but his most critical contribution was yet to come. In the summer of 1962, the KGB began to get suspicious. They noticed that Penkovsky was meeting foreigners too often. They noticed he was spending money he shouldn't have. They started to watch him. They installed a camera in the flower box outside his apartment window. They watched him reading documents late at night. They watched him fiddling with his radio. They didn't arrest him immediately. They wanted to see who he was working with. They wanted to catch the whole network. Penkovsky sensed the net closing. He sent a desperate signal to the CIA. "I am under surveillance." But before he could be extracted, the Cuban Missile Crisis erupted in October 1962. When the U-2 photos arrived on President Kennedy's desk, the CIA analysts were under immense pressure. They were looking at blurry photos of construction sites in the Cuban jungle. They needed to know, what are these missiles? How far can they fly? Are they operational? Without Penkovsky, it would have been a guessing game. But thanks to Colonel Hero, the analysts had the owner's manual for the missiles. They pulled out Penkovsky's documents. They compared the schematics of the Soviet R-12 and R-14 missiles with the shapes in the photos. It was a perfect match. Because of Penkovsky, Kennedy knew exactly what those missiles could do. He knew the R-12 could hit Washington, D.C. He knew how long it took to fuel them. He knew how long it took to prep them for launch. Most importantly, Penkovsky's intelligence told Kennedy that the Soviet long-range arsenal back in Russia was weak. He knew that if push came to shove, the United States could win a nuclear exchange. This knowledge gave Kennedy the confidence to stand firm. He didn't panic. He ignored the generals who wanted to invade Cuba immediately. He set up the naval blockade. He called Khrushchev's bluff. Khrushchev, realizing that the Americans knew his weakness, blinked. He agreed to remove the missiles. The world stepped back from the brink. But while the world was celebrating peace, Oleg Penkovsky was being destroyed. On October 22, 1962, the very day Kennedy addressed the nation about the missiles, the KGB arrested Penkovsky. They arrested him in his office. They stripped him of his uniform. They raided his apartment and found the Minox camera and the code books hidden in a secret drawer in his desk. They also arrested Greville Wynne in Hungary and dragged him back to Moscow. The interrogation of Oleg Penkovsky was brutal. But unlike many spies who break under torture, Penkovsky reportedly remained defiant, at least for a while. He admitted his actions, but argued that he did it to save Russia from a madman. His trial in May 1963 was a show trial. It was broadcast on Soviet television. Penkovsky sat in the dock, looking gaunt and broken. He recited a scripted confession. The Soviet prosecutor called him scum and a traitor to the motherland. Greville Wynne was sentenced to 8 years in prison. He was later exchanged for a Soviet spy. Oleg Penkovsky was sentenced to death. The official Soviet record states that he was executed by firing squad on May 16, 1963. A bullet to the back of the head. Quick, standard. But in the dark corridors of the intelligence world, a different story is whispered. A story much more terrifying. A story that fits the ruthlessness of the GRU. According to a defector from the GRU named Vladimir Resun, who wrote under the name Viktor Suvorov, Penkovsky was not shot. The legend says that to send a message to other potential traitors, the GRU elite gathered in a room at their headquarters. Penkovsky was brought in. He was strapped to a stretcher. He was still alive. They slowly pushed him into a cremation oven. He was burned alive, screaming, while his former colleagues watched through a glass window. Some versions of the story say the entire execution was filmed, and that this film was shown to every new GRU recruit for the next 20 years. A grim warning. This is what happens to traitors. There is no escape. Whether he died by a bullet or by fire, the end of Oleg Penkovsky was tragic. He is a complicated figure. To the Soviets, he was the worst kind of villain. A man who sold his country for ego and revenge. A man who betrayed the uniform. But to the West, and to history, he is a savior. Without his betrayal, the Cuban Missile Crisis might have ended very differently. If Kennedy had miscalculated, if he had thought the Soviets were stronger than they were, or if he had underestimated the missiles in Cuba, the nuclear war might have started. Millions of people living today owe their lives to the vanity and the courage of the colonel with the Minox camera. Greville Wynne, the man who was dragged into this nightmare, never fully recovered from his time in the Soviet Gulag. He wrote books about his experience, always portraying Penkovsky as a hero who knew exactly what he was doing. In the end, Penkovsky achieved his goal. He stopped Khrushchev. 2 years after the crisis, Khrushchev was ousted from power by his own party, largely because of his reckless failure in Cuba. The Shadow Dossier on Penkovsky is a file about the grey areas of morality. Is a traitor a hero if his treason saves the world? Most spies steal secrets to win a war. Penkovsky stole secrets to prevent one. He sacrificed his life, his honor, and his family to ensure that the button was never pushed. He stands as a reminder that sometimes the most effective weapon against a totalitarian regime is a single man who decides that he has seen enough. This concludes the file on Oleg Penkovsky. We have seen the missions, the gadgets, and the men who changed history. But the Cold War wasn't just fought in embassies and missile silos. It was fought in the shadows of revenge. Next time, we turn to a story of pure retribution. A story of a team of assassins sent out with a list of names and a license to kill. We are going to open the file on the aftermath of the Munich Olympics massacre. We are going to look at the operation where the Mossad hunted down the terrorists one by one across Europe and the Middle East.